Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being taken down to its nuts and bolts. There is a saying on your planet that novices study tactics, professionals study logistics. This isn't entirely wrong, but I would argue it is incomplete. Because yes, tactics are just the beginning and logistics are how you make those tactics happen. But savants study communication. Because without the ability to communicate your intention or desires, you are not going to get any logistical support or be able to execute your tactics. So what does this mean in the grand scheme of things? Well, for a long time in your history, your military force's entire existence was bounded by various musical instruments, because oddly enough, certain musical instruments are very useful at sending signals long distances in ways that people can understand and comprehend easily. A great example of this is your modern Navy's ship's bell. Now, granted, the ship's bell is basically not used for anything significant anymore. I guess it is actually used for the general quarters, or emergency signal, and I won't play it again since I have taken advantage of that knee-jerk reaction probably a few too many times, but it's the rapid ringing of a bell immediately preceding a emergency signal over the loudspeaker system on the ship called the 1MC. They're also used for ringing aboard the captain, sometimes the XO, and any significant dignitaries, and the number of strokes on the bell indicates how important the person is. For example, in your United States, the president of that nation-state thing gets 8 strokes of the bell, no pun intended, along with the vice president getting the same, and the chief of naval operations also getting the same. This falls back to the history of what's called side boys, but that's a whole separate conversation. The only other remaining use of bells is to signal where the ship is in cases of extreme fog. Now, if the ship is underway, she should be using a fog horn, but when she is anchored and of sufficient sizes, there should be a bell somewhere near the bow, and a gong, which is basically a larger bell, somewhere near the stern, and every less than minute or so, you should do 5 seconds of rapid ringing on the forward bell, followed by 5 seconds of rapid ringing on the stern gong. And that basically allows your binaural hearing system to figure out where the ship is, so hopefully you avoid it. But once upon a time in a midnight dreary, the bell was the ship's way of telling time. You see, timepieces weren't a thing you wore on your wrist when ship's bells were used to keep time. In fact, timepieces weren't hardly even a thing for a variety of reasons. Mostly because they were mechanically complex, and basically people didn't have the means of making them reliably at the time, but secondarily because literally the motion of the ship and the motion of the ship through the planet's magnetic field affected the timepiece's accuracy. So the further the ship got from home port, the more magnetic field it crossed, and the more waves and whatever it rolled its way through, the less accurate the timepiece would become. So instead, ships used something that is not affected by magnetic fields, even though they probably didn't even know what magnetic fields were at the time. They used an hourglass. They had a 30-minute hourglass, and every time it ran out, it was the watchstander's duty to flip it over and start it over again. However, when he flipped it over, he started bells. Timekeeping bells are typically signaled in sets of up to 2. So you have a signal of 1, or a signal of 2, and then you move on to a signal of 2, pause 1, then 2, pause 2, and then so on and so forth. And given that you humies have decided on a 24-hour cycle for your planetary rotation, the first bell happened at midnight 30, or 0030, or 12:30 at night. You have so many ways of keeping track of time, but basically 30 minutes after midnight. 2 bells happened 1 hour after midnight. 3 bells happened 1:30 after midnight. 4 bells happened 2 hours after midnight, and so on and so forth, all the way up to 8 bells at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the bell count recycled at 4:30. It started at 1 again, and then 2 at 5, 3 at 5:30, and so on and so forth. And it went all the way around to midnight, which once again was 8 bells, so we can start at 1 at midnight 30 once again. So yeah, for a very long time, sailors' lives were entirely circumscribed by bell counts. In fact, a lot of watchstanders on modern naval vessels still refer to their watch as 4 bells or 7 bells or whatever time they're coming on watch. Every ship does it a little differently. But bells were very much an integral part of nautical everything for centuries now. Now, while, like I said, bells were an essential part of nautical history, an interesting place where your nautical and your terrestrial militaries overlap is that of a bugle. I suppose because your nautical military still have to have ground-based bases from which to station their ships and repair them and maintain them and barracks their sailors and whatnot else. But regardless, the armies and marines and other ground-based militaries of the world did not, of course, use a bell. Bells require a stand. Bells are heavy. Bells clang around if you move them, as armies frequently do. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So instead, they used a trumpet without buttons, called a bugle. Apparently, it's limited to natural harmonic tones by the fact that the only way you can change the pitch of the sound is by varying your embouchure. Apparently, those lip things on the front of your face are important to how this thing works. I have no idea how, not important. The big deal is that unlike the bell, which only had the one note, so you varied how you used that note, the bugle has 5 available notes, and you can still vary how you use those 5 individual notes. More complex, I guess. And so the Army did basically all long-range, well, not long-range, but like unit-level communication with bugles, because it is a very sharp, piercing noise. And you could do everything from call your soldiers to assemble to sound a charge, which I'm sure is a sound everyone knows, even if you didn't know what the sound was. Yes, that was the signal for troops to just charge towards the enemy with no concern for themselves and see what would happen afterwards. I mean, everyone's heard that, if only because of cavalry charges in movies and such like. But speaking of horses, and speaking of your terrestrial militaries, and ironically speaking of your nautical militaries, some of these bugle calls get repurposed over time. For example, I'm sure at least some of you have heard this one, at least in some movies somewhere. So generally that is referred to as first call. For the terrestrial militaries, that is basically a signal to the trumpeteers at about 0550 to assemble so that they can deliver reveille at 0600. For the Navy, it is basically a warning that colors will be sounding at 0800 and later again at whenever the colors come down. It's dependent upon sunset. And it's basically warning you that if you're outside in the next 5 minutes, you should stand to and observe the colors. And by that, of course, the Navy means the raising of the national ensign and then the lowering of the national ensign. However, where most of you have probably heard it is at a horse race. You humies take equines and stick little tiny humies on top of them and run them around a track. It's bizarre. But in any case, this is basically the signal to tell the riders to take their horses out of the paddock and go do some sort of parade nonsense. I don't know how a martial bugle call ended up being at a horse race, but this is kind of the point I've been spending probably way too much time building up to. Things sometimes get reused. I mean, the military, the terrestrial military specifically, has signals for all kinds of things, like adjutants' calls, and boots and saddles, and guard mount, and recall, and pay call, and mail call, which is probably one that all the troops knew like 3 days into their service. But much like the nautical military on your planet, a terrestrial military member's day was bound by bugle calls. There was, of course, reveille, which started the day. There was mess call, which invited them to breakfast. There was drill call. There was assembly call. There were all these various calls, almost finally ending with retreat, which signals the end of the official day. And almost finally, the penultimate call was something called tattoo, which signals that all lights in all public rooms should be extinguished and that all loud talking and other disturbances should definitely be stopped in the next 15 minutes. Because 15 minutes after that comes something that I'm sure you all know, and that's called taps. Yes, originally taps was the last call of the day. It was a sign that all unauthorized lights should be extinguished and y'all should just rack out. But, as with the first call, it has a different use, although that different use is still confined to the military. Which, I suppose, brings me to the whole point of this episode. This weekend in your United States on your planet is referred to as Memorial Day. Now, I have gone over previously how there is a distinction between Veterans Day and Memorial Day. But one of the distinctions is that those people you are remembering on Memorial Day probably had taps played at their funeral. Because as much as taps is a signal of the end of the day, it is also a signal of the end of a life. Now, of course, some countries use different signals, and some countries don't use an auditory signal at all. But, apocryphally, taps was adapted to its funereal purpose because someone was having to bury someone else during wartime in an active combat environment, and they figured that the bugle call would draw less attention to their position than the traditional 21-gun salute. It probably wasn't wrong. And ever since then, there are buglers who play taps at almost every military funeral. In fact, there are organizations across the entire nation-state of the United States who are willing to offer volunteer buglers at any military funeral there might be. One such one, for example, is Bugles Across America. And this should, perhaps, indicate to you how important traditions are to the military. Because, sometimes people serve for 2 to 4 years and get out and never think of their military service again. But by serving at all, they are part of the military. And there are people who would very much like to have that remembered when those other people finally leave your planet. In a fatal way, not in a hopefully upcoming way that you can leave your planet without dying. And they take time out of their day. They drive distances that are immaterial on the galactic scale, but probably take them a good long time. And they stand up in front of an audience they don't know, and they play taps. Because they believe it is the right thing to do, because they believe it is the proper thing to do, and because they can do it. And so, on this apparent Sunday before your United States Memorial Day, I would like to end this episode with a video that was sent to me by a fan of one of his offsprings playing taps as a volunteer at a funeral. Because he, too, like so many others, thought it was the right and proper thing to do, and he could do it.